Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. If this is your first webinar Wednesday with us, just a little bit of an overview and some quick housekeeping. My name is Dr. Liz Eckelkamp. I think most of you already know me, but these will be roughly an hour. You are already on mute when you enter the meeting. If you have a question or would like to make a comment, feel free to unmute and I'll call on you throughout, raise your hand, or post a question in the chat box. And we'll either answer as we go, or if there's a bunch of similar questions, I'll probably hold them to the end. We're pretty informal, so if you have a question throughout, just holler and we'll stop and we'll talk about it as we discuss. This meeting is being recorded, so we will post it later for Master Dairy Credit for anyone who wasn't able to be there today. As a reminder, if you're interested in getting Master Dairy Producer Credit through this program, you need to watch at least 6 hours of educational material, or 3 if you already did one of our 2 earlier programs this year. That would be the TDPA meeting in January or the Master Dairy meeting that we did in February. And I really need y'all to fill out the online completion form to receive credit, and I'll throw that in the chat in a minute so you have an easy access to that. And if you're an agent looking for in-service credit, we will be posting this to Kate later to receive in-service credit for that. We do have a special guest with us today, my new friend Bethany Deshpande from somatic. And at the end, she's going to talk a little bit about her insights into precision technology and where she thinks we're going to go in the future. The goal for today is more to do an overview of what kinds of precision technology are out there and some of the economics behind the decisions of investing in a precision technology. So we'll get started here in a minute, and I'll keep monitoring to see if anybody else needs to be let in. Are there any questions before we get started? I don't see any hands. Everybody's staying on mute. So I will stop sharing my video and we will jump right in. And excuse my divided attention, guys, as I let people into the room. So the goal of today is to talk about precision dairy that pays. With precision technologies, what we really mean is something that enhances or replaces human observation or labor. And one of the things that we need to think about with the precision technology is that it has to do a better job than we do on our own, or as good of a job as we do on our own. It can also supplement human data collection or decision making. So even if it does just as good of a job as we do at noting a change or picking up on a behavior, if it can combine that data with other information, it can help improve our decision-making process around something like which cow to keep, what kind of mastitis treatment we need to do, at what point do we need to start looking for disease detection, or what replacements do we need to make in the herd. With precision dairy management specifically, we're talking about the use of automated, mechanized technologies toward refinement of dairy management processes, procedures, or information collection. So we're talking about a pretty wide array of things, and we'll get into different categories of those later. But that can go from everything as far as record keeping all the way to robotic milking or even inline detection of mastitis. What we're really looking at is the business intelligence and analytics side of precision dairy technologies. So we're looking at moving up and along this table. So we're talking about our degree of intelligence, that increasing, and our competitive advantage increasing. So theoretically, the more intelligent reporting that we have, the better competitive advantage we have as a business, no matter what kind of business we're talking about. So where we're really at right now with a lot of our precision technologies in the livestock sector is standard reports. It tells us what happened. So if you have something like a Fitbit or a step counter of any kind, no matter what brand it is, you get a standard report. You know exactly how many steps you took today. You know exactly how much time you spent sleeping. You know what your heart rate is throughout the day, but it doesn't really give you more information than that. It's up to you to figure out, is that the right number of steps for me? Is that what my target goal was? If you're just looking at specifically a standard report. If we move up a little bit, if I go the correct way, we're getting more to something like an alert with what actions are needed. And if we look at the dairy sector, we've seen this a lot with things like electroconductivity, when that spikes beyond a reasonable range and we say this cow might have mastitis, or more recently with something like heat detection, estrus detection, we know that a certain number of parameters changed in a way that we can quantify. And now we're going to say it's time to breed that cow based on that information and based on that alert. As we continue moving, we can theoretically get to something like predictive modeling, which is what will happen next. And we're kind of seeing this in the disease analysis sector. We're looking for a lot of patterns of behavior early on in that animal's life, particularly with fresh cow disorders, and predicting what we're going to have out of that. We're predicting there's going to be a case of ketosis. We're predicting there's going to be a case of mastitis, or she's going to have milk fever, or maybe she's going to be lame. But a lot of times these behaviors that we're picking up on happen before we can visually see it with our eyes. So we're saying that we're going to predict that something's going to happen in the future. Eventually, and this is a little bit further down the line, hopefully we can combine all of these different things together to optimize our operation and try to come up with the best outcome. And that can be combining record data from all of the animals that we have on our herd, genetic information if we have it, their past disease history, and any kind of milk production data we get from them during that lactation, any kind of disease information we get from them from that lactation, and say, which animal is the most sustainable, most efficient, best fit for my farm, which one is giving me the most bang for my buck, and which one do I want to continue investing in? Like I said, we're really not there yet, but hopefully that's where we can go with all of this data and all of this information that we're collecting. In the world today, we hear a lot about the Internet of Things, which is kind of thinking about how connected we are as a person to all the other things around us. So I'm gonna ask some of y'all to unmute and answer these questions for me. How many of you have a smartphone, or just use the raise your hand chat function? If you go to participants, there's, yep, I see run hand. Who all has a smartphone? Raise your hands. Only 2 of you. I find that very hard to believe. All right, we've got quite a few with smartphones. Now, how many of you who has an Amazon account? Quite a few of you. Who wants to have to re-log into that Amazon account every time you go between the computer and your phone or your TV or your tablet? Anybody? Anybody want to log in 5 or 6 times? Those hands are going away awful quick. So we want something that connects us to everything else. So anything, any device, anyone, anybody, any service, any business, any path, any network, any place, anywhere, anytime, any context. We're living in a very connected world right now. But what we're moving towards in the livestock sector and in the crop sector as well, but if we're going to focus on dairy today, we're thinking about the Internet of Cows. And what we're thinking about with the Internet of Cows is connecting all of those animals and looking not just at the herd, but also looking at the individual, and being able to do that through some kind of wearable or through the milk line itself or through the robot, looking at some kind of base station with some kind of remote management that's also going to go to our phone. So we're not having to go to 5 or 6 different locations to get that information. And we're able to take that individual animal data and really drill in to see how they're performing, and then look at our herd as a whole and see how our herd is performing. If we're thinking about technology specifically, we're thinking about the pathway to success of what we want all those technologies to do in the future. So we already talked about not wanting to log into a whole bunch of different things. How many of you like it when your devices don't work together? Like you absolutely cannot get this particular app on your iPhone or on your Android because it's only made for one platform. How many of y'all really like that? Show of hands. I'm not seeing any hands. I don't like it either. So integration across technologies, even in the livestock sector and in the dairy sector, is really important. Nobody wants to enter their data across 5 different platforms to get 5 different answers in 5 different ways. We also want that to be something that can be analyzed, but we don't want to have to do all of that work ourselves as a farmer. No one wants to read rows and rows and rows and rows of spreadsheet data. What we want is something that's analyzed in the background and then visualize in a way that we can implement tomorrow, which is why we like to see graphs. We like to see targeted lists of animals that need to be bred or animals that need to be caught. If it's your robot, maybe it's your average production that day, and a green dial that says this is good, this is bad, this is about normal for you, these are the number of fetch cows you have, this is up, this is down. Same thing with the wearable technology. This is the normal movement for your herd. This is what a drop in activity looks like for these particular animals. These are how many of them are popping up on the alert list today. So we want to analyze in the background adequately, but visualize in a way that's easy for us to digest and easy for us to manage. Because those of you who are dairy farmers, you've already got enough going on in your day. Adding something that's cumbersome to that mix just makes it really difficult to manage. If we think about what drives investment overall, there are 4 main things that have been identified with driving investment in the livestock sector and in dairy in particular. Number 1 is economic gains, because at the end of the day, a dairy farm is a business. So we want to make sure that anything we're investing in makes economic sense for our operation. Another big one is labor change or replacement, either changing over to a better source of labor that doesn't not show up on time, or that's always there when you need them, always does it the same way every time, or replacing that labor entirely. Animal welfare is another big one, making sure that we have a way to categorize the welfare of those animals and the quality of life of those animals. But it's not just quality of life for the animal, it's also quality of life for the farmer, whether it's peace of mind knowing something's always watching those animals, whether it's getting a day off from being in the barn all day, every day, or having something go in and automatically feed or automatically record what's going on. And the 2 that are really difficult to quantify economically are animal welfare and quality of life, which is why when we talk about economics today, we're going to talk a little bit in generalities, because it's hard to really identify what the value is of that animal welfare and what the value is of that quality of life change, because that's going to be different for every farmer and for every situation. If we think about things that stop investment, particularly in the dairy sector, this was some work done out of Kentucky in 2012, 2013. One of the main things is unfamiliarity with technologies, not really knowing what's out there, not knowing what the best one is going to be, and not really knowing things like a cost to benefit ratio. How long is it going to take me to pay back this technology? What kind of benefits am I going to get from that, whether they're tangible or intangible benefits? Another one is information overload. Quite often we'll have technologies hit the market that aren't really farm ready, and you get a lot of raw data and a lot of raw information that can be difficult to then turn around into something meaningful for your farm. Another one is not enough time to spend on the technology, whether that's the initial application of these technologies, physically putting them on animals, physically installing it on your farm, or taking the time to learn what that technology does. Quite often these systems are very time intensive. So sometimes you need a single person that's dedicated just to these technologies, which is where the labor question really becomes a little bit difficult. And how much is it saving me on labor overall? Another one is lack of perceived economic value. And sometimes that's because the technology you're considering isn't necessarily the best fit for your farm. There's a lot of technologies out there that do a lot of different things. And most of our commercially available technologies in the US, whether they're wearable, whether they're inline, whether they're a robotic standalone system, a lot of them work very well. And there's many different companies that have something very similar. And they all tend to perform fairly similarly. So the bigger thing to look at, and we'll get at this in a minute, is what kind of technology do you need to fit the needs on your specific operation? If we think about what counts as technology, normally this is when I would quiz the room, and we'll kind of do it through the chat. So message me and what do you think of when you think of precision technology for dairy? I've gotten a couple messages already, so I know some of you have the ability to use the chat. What do you think of when you think precision tech? All right, record keeping systems, automated milking, what else? Something like a heat detection system, sure. Automatic feeding, absolutely. All right, yep, all of those definitely count. So we'll go through what some of those could be. The first one that I tend to think of, and it's just one that I've had a lot more experience with, is wearable technologies. And a lot of times we think of these when we're thinking about an estrus detection system. So we have things that can go on the neck, things that can go on the ear, things that can go on the leg. There's lots of different options that would all go underneath that wearable hat. And quite often these are used for things like heat detection. Potentially they could be used for disease detection. And some of them also do temperature. Some of them do lying time, standing time, activity. Some of them might also do calving detection, depending on the tag that you're investing in. Others can be part of the milking system, and that would be something that's inline, like looking at components, fat and protein, or somatic cell count, or they are the milking system itself, so it's a robotic system. Some others can be standalone. Feed pushers are some of these, brushes are some of these, or even something like a body condition scoring camera. The last one that I also sometimes we don't think about would be management software, and that's whatever kind of management software you're using, whether it's PC Dart, whether it's Dairy Comp 305, whether you're using Alpro, Delpro, whatever system you're using to manage your data, that also counts as a precision technology. If we start with feeding, we've got a lot of different options. We have some things that have been around for a while, like the old school computer feeders, and some that are newer players to the game, like a full-on automated TMR system. Automated TMR mixing, there's only a couple commercially available that I know of, and one of the ones that we've seen a lot more of recently is the Lely Vector. And the cool thing about the Lely Vector is it's not only a feed pusher, it also has a laser sight that measures at what point the feed drops below that laser sight, and it knows to automatically go and mix more feed, which is pretty neat. It can load in from grain bays, and it also has this handy dandy feed grabber to go out into the feed kitchen and add things like your hays or your haylages to your ration. It can hold more than one ration format in that Lely mixer, so you can feed multiple cows at different stages through that one wagon. So it goes out to the feed kitchen, mixes everything up, comes back and dispenses it to those cows, and then we'll continue pushing the feed throughout. And that's a really cool piece of technology. Automated milking systems, I know we have several people on here, and they are exactly what they sound like. It is a robot that the cow walks into to be milked. And in the US, we have more of these individual box stall systems, but there are some automatic rotaries other places in the world where the cow walks up and you have different stages of robots along the rotary to handle larger amounts of animals. In the US, our robots, well, I guess worldwide, our individual stall robots tend to handle anywhere from 55 to 60 animals per robot. So you need multiple robots if you have more than that in your herd. If we think about some key success factors for robots specifically, and I think they apply to most precision technologies, we have to have realistic expectations. And one of those realistic expectations that we have to have is that when we install a technology, it is not going to be the end-all be-all and cannot just exist on its own without any kind of management or any kind of oversight from the farm. Now, most people have that realistic expectation, but occasionally someone will invest in a technology thinking that it needs minimal oversight or minimal intervention, and that's just not the case. It is a piece of equipment, it's going to break down, things are going to go wrong, which is why number 2 is so important, and that's having a good support team. And that support team may be somebody that you work with as part of your farm management team, or that good support system may be someone that works with the company that you purchased it from. One of the most important things to consider with a technology purchase is what kind of support do you have on the back end from whoever you purchased that technology from. If it's from a robot company, are they going to come out and do periodic checks? Are they going to come out and do periodic maintenance for you? Are they going to be there when you have a question and you need to call because it's 2 a.m. and the robot's blowing up your phone because something's gone down? If it's a wearable technology system, are they going to work with you if you have tags that break? Are they going to work with you if you're having problems with the software? Are they going to help connect you to someone who can incorporate that technology with your existing management program? If it's a calf feeder, same question. Are they going to be there when the calf feeder goes down? Or if you have problems with your protocol, or if you have problems making sure everything's cleaned on time, Are they going to answer the phone and be there when you have those questions? The next one is flexibility and discipline to control the system and the cows. Anytime we add a new management tool, especially a technology, we have to be able to continue managing the cows and be able to add on that addition of managing this new system. You're going to have to learn how to use it. You're going to have to learn how to implement it. And you're going to have to learn how to push that into part of your daily management, because it can very easily become information overload. You have to have the ability to use a computer if you have one of these systems. You need to pay attention to the barn layout and cow traffic. That's going to be robot specific. Attention to the system function maintenance. That's going to be true no matter which technology we're looking at. And for robots specifically, we need healthy cows that have good feet and are good eaters, because we want them to be able to walk consistently to the robot so we don't have a huge fetch cow list. With data management solutions, quite often we have a data management solution that is a pad of paper and a pen, which is great if you're writing down what's going on with your farm, what's going on with your operation throughout the day. I tend to use my phone as a notepad and text my husband all the time when something pops into my head, or else I'll lose it. But writing it down with a pen and paper is also a great way to use that data. However, if it just stays on the pen and the paper, over time what tends to happen is when that little notepad gets full and there's no more space on it, it goes into a drawer with a whole lot of other notepads that have writing on it from years and years and years and years of writing down things that happen on your farm. If it just stays on the notepad, going back through and looking for information for one cow over her lifetime gets really difficult. Going back and looking for information over multiple generations becomes almost impossible because of having to get in there and find the specific notebook, hoping that the moisture in the tank room hasn't destroyed it, hoping that the mice haven't found it, or that bugs haven't gotten to it to completely obliterate anything that you used to have written there. So combining that pad with the power of a management system, whether that is an Excel sheet that you make yourself, whether that's something that you invest in like PC Dart or something like Dairy Comp 305, that really takes that from being information on a page to data that you can use. And the cool thing about a lot of technologies nowadays is that there have been bridges built that will talk with either something like Dairy Comp or something like PC Dart. So all of that information that you've already taken the time to put into that data management system can then be translated over when you get that additional data from your wearable technology or from your robot or from your inline system. That way it's all combined in a way that's easy for you to read, easy for you to digest, and you're not inputting that data multiple times. With precision dairy monitoring, we're looking more at things like the milk, so what's going on, and that can be inline or that could be a standalone system. Behavior, which is usually some kind of wearable technology, but we're moving more into an age now where we can pick up behaviors with things like cameras. Physiology, which isn't done super often, but some things like temperature we can incorporate, or even rumen pH. And then conformation as well. With precision dairy monitoring, we have several different uses that we tend to think of. Things like estrus detection, pregnancy detection is becoming slightly more common or more investigated. Mastitis detection is one that we all really, really want to work well, but we're working on that a little bit. Fresh cow disease detection is another new player to the game. Lameness detection, calving detection, and even management monitoring. Some farms that I worked with during my PhD up at Kentucky, we had 2 different types of wearable tags on every cow on the farm. And these amazing people, you'll see some of the data from that later, went through the trouble of writing down every single day what they did with health alerts generated from that technology. Whether they used it and then checked a cow with it afterwards, whether they looked at it but didn't really want to follow up on it because they knew why that alert might have happened, something like moving to a different group where it was vet check day, or if they just flat out didn't believe the alert was true at all. On a couple of these farms, we would have days where every single animal was on the alert list. And we found that a couple different things happened. One day, everybody came on for eating attentions. Everybody's eating time plummeted. Well, we found out that the helper didn't show up that day to go out there and actually feed the cows on time. So everybody's eating time plummeted. Another day, everybody's activity skyrocketed. We weren't really sure what happened until we found out that a dog had gotten on the property and chased the cows around the barn. So even for non-traditional things that we wouldn't think about using to manage with the technology, we were still able to pick that up looking at changes in behavior in those animals. If we think about all the different things that we could potentially measure on a cow, a lot of them we can't really see. And we can't, or we have very subjective. So things like fatness or thinness. Body condition scoring is horribly subjective. If we all went out there and body condition scored, there are 20 of us online, I guarantee you we'd have a good at least 15 differences in body condition, maybe even 20, depending on which system we were using and how often we've done it and how long it's been since we practiced. But we have a camera that can take out some of the things that we tend to bias ourselves with. Like, is it a fresher cow? Is it a cow that's longer in lactation? Is she about to go dry? Will I give her a little grace period here or there? That's also something that we'll do with lameness. If we do lameness scoring, it's also very subjective, especially if we're doing a scoring system of 5 versus a scoring system of 3. And that's another one of those areas where we tend to make some allowances for animals if we know them really well. If we know that it's a cow that just finished freshening in, she had a pretty rough start, we're probably going to be okay with her being a little bit thinner and maybe a little bit lame because we know that something happened to put her in that condition. So we're willing to let her kind of slide by and say, that's okay, we'll come back later and she's going to get better, so it's not that big of a deal. Another thing would be chewing activity or rumination. Now, we can count that one by one, hand by hand for every single minute and say, all right, so this is exactly how many breaths she took. This is exactly how many chews she took. But not too many of us want to sit there with our phone or have time to sit there with our phone and time it for 60 seconds, count how many of those were, then multiply that out for a minute. We'd much prefer technology that does that for us. Same thing with heart rate, same thing with milk content. If we have an inline system that does that for us, it makes it a little bit easier on us on the front end. And like I said before, the options are endless. This is just a small subsection and sample of the technologies that are out there. Some of them are ones that are more common, and we'll go through these a little bit more in a minute. But the purpose of this slide is not to say these are the ones you have to buy or these are the only ones that are out there, just to give you a different idea of all the things that could potentially be used as a precision technology on your farm, which is probably why we get back into not really knowing what technologies are out there, like we saw from that survey that Russell and Bewley did in 2013, and also not really knowing which ones are the best fit for my farm or which ones make the most sense as an investment. If we think about the benefits of precision dairy, there are several that we could think of, and they would be improved animal health and well-being, early detection of things like estrus or disease or potentially even lameness, increased efficiency of that animal and of our time, improved product quality because we're finding those issues early, we're able to resolve those issues earlier, theoretically resulting in more milk with a lower somatic cell count, minimal adverse environmental impacts because if we have those animals running efficiently, we're getting more milk for our animals, so more bang for our buck, both for production and environmental standpoint, and more objective measures. Like we talked about before, we're taking some of the subjectivity out of things like looking at lameness or looking at body condition. And this is going to be more of a wish list for technology and not necessarily something that you're going to have in every one. But the more of these boxes that we can tick, the better served we are with that technology. So we're going to want a technology that explains an underlying biological process. So we want a technology that has a good outcome. So maybe we could have a technology that tells us if a cow is black and white dominant versus red and white dominant just by looking at the cow, which would be pretty easy because one would be black and white, one would be red and white. So that's great. It works 100% of the time. But is that really something that we need to invest in a technology? Probably not. It needs to be translated to a meaningful action. If this tells us exactly how much time a cow spends staring at a fence post, is that really going to be translated to a meaningful action? Probably not. And this is where we can get into some issues with something like behavioral data, not because it's bad data, not because it's wrong, but if we can't translate it into a meaningful action, we need to make it a little bit more useful. Disease detection is one of those big ones, especially if we're starting to pick up changes way before we can see any kind of clinical sign. All right, well then what do we do? If I have a certainty that this cow is going to have something that's a fresh cow disorder, what do I do next? Do I look for her BHBA to see if she's got ketosis? Do I take a calcium test to look for milk fever? Do I palpate to look for metritis? It's a lot of additional steps. So having a disease alert that says something may be happening is probably not really a meaningful action, which is why we focused a lot more on estrus detection to get that to the market, because that's a very clear, meaningful action. We have a heat alert, time to go out and breed a cow. We want it to be cost effective, and that doesn't mean the cheapest thing on the market. It means we want it to be able to pay for itself. We don't want any additional supplies to be cost prohibitive so that we only use it once. We also need it to be flexible, robust, and reliable, because cows will and do break technology. So if it can't set up to the cow and it can't set up to the farm, it's probably not an ideal technology for you. We want the technology and the readouts from it to be simple and solution focused. So we don't want to have to go through 5 or 6 different things to get to the answer that we're really looking for, kind of like what we said with translated to a meaningful action. We also want that information to be readily available. One of the biggest issues that we would find going out and doing calcium tests with some of our farmers right during the start of lactation was that once we took that blood sample, once we dropped off that sample with the vet lab, and it was about a week later before we actually had any diagnostic results for them. So we could tell them that the cow did have milk fever, but it wasn't really readily available. So at that point, they'd either already treated the cow or she'd already experienced clinical milk fever and they'd had to take those next steps. So we want that to be readily available information that is timely continuously, not just a one-time data dump. With financial benefits, there's a couple different things that we can think of. And one of the ones that we tend to think of first is increased production. And we tend to think about that a lot with either health benefits or increased milking time with something like a robot. Decreased labor can be another one, but we have to take that one with a grain of salt, because even if we are replacing 1 or 2 people with something like a robot or something like a calf feeder, if we're not going to be the ones managing that equipment and managing that computer and looking at all that information, we may need to pay a more skilled laborer to come in and run that computer and look through all that information and manage the technology resource. So we might decrease our total number of laborers, but our labor bill might stay about the same. We can also hopefully improve animal health. So decreased sick days, increased animal efficiency, decreased vet bills, all of that comes underneath improved animal health. We can also improve our estrus detection, and heat detection is a big one that can have an economic impact kind of right away if we're improving that from just visual observation. And we'll get into that more a little bit later. Another one is reduced culls, particularly during early lactation. Right when that animal calves is when she's going to have some of the highest value on your operation, because you've invested all of this time into this animal, she just dropped a calf, and now she's going to start paying you back through milk production. Well, if you lose an animal during those first 30 days, the opportunity to cost to you is huge, because now you've spent all this time, all this money invested into this animal, and there's been no repayment on that investment. So ideally, we're going to be replacing a cow later on in lactation when she's not pregnant, because that's when it's going to make the most financial sense for you. So if we can reduce those early lactation culls or reduce those early lactation deaths, we can actually improve the farm's bottom line. If we think about the financial cost side, it's the cost of the technology itself, whether that's going to be a wearable technology, whether that's going to be a robot or a calf feeder, what have you. That overall technology, and then any other support things that are required. So if you need a base station to collect that data, if you need wireless readers to go across the farm, if you need to run Cat5 cable across the farm. Also, as a reminder, raccoons really love Cat5 cable, so look out for them while you're spreading it. Increased feed intake is another one, particularly with increased milk production. If we're pulling more milk out of that animal, more groceries need to go into that animal. And another one, like we talked about before, would be more skilled labor. When we think about economic feasibility, there's 3 main things that we tend to see in the literature and that we tend to talk about when we talk about it. First, that was redundant, sorry y'all. The first one is payback period. We want that payback period to be less than the life expectancy of the technology. And what payback period means is the amount of time, usually in years, that it takes to recoup the cost of that investment. And depending on what type of technology we're investing in, that life expectancy of technology could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 20 years. It just depends on if we're talking about something that's wearable or something like a robot. What kind of technology are we talking about? We also want the return on investment to be greater than the cost of technology and added costs. For something like a wearable technology, this would be any replacement bands that you need to put a neck collar back on or put leg tags back on. It may be a licensing fee if you're working with someone that helps manage your data. It's going to be not just the technology, but installing that technology the first time and maintaining that technology upkeep over time. We also want it to have a net present value greater than or equal to 0 to be a positive investment for your farm. When we're considering this thing, remember, and you all know this, that each farm situation is unique. There is no one size fits all with technology, which is why, like with everything else in extension, it's our favorite answer, which is it depends. So the thing you need to think about first is, what is the largest need on your farm? If the largest need on your farm is new fans because the amount of heat stress on your animals is keeping them from getting pregnant, buying a heat detection system is not going to fix the fact that your animals are heat stressed and that they need fans. So go through the list of what do I need to do first in order to improve this on my farm. If your largest need is knowing when your animals are eating because you're having a lot of issues in early lactation, you're probably going to want some kind of either neck tag or ear tag that gives you a rumination or an eating time variable. If you're really focused in on heat detection, you can get away with pretty much any technology that's out there that's a wearable, whether that's a leg tag, a neck collar, or an ear tag. You want to have an idea of what your neighbors have used. You all talk to each other a lot of the time anyway about management decisions. Figure out what they've used, what they like about it, what they wish they had better, and really what kind of service are they getting from their service team. And you really need to pay attention to who has a good service team in your area. A lot of times the technologies are created equal, but the service teams aren't. So make sure that there's someone there that's going to be there and help you through all this stuff. And the last thing is the technology my best option? Like I said about before with what's the largest need on your farm? If the largest need on your farm is heat stress, then a technology is not going to be your best option, unless it's a technology to turn on the sprinklers and turn on the fans. We also need to think a little bit about sensitivity and specificity of the technology. And the first thing that we're going to think about is a type 1 error or a false positive. Clearly this gentleman is not pregnant, but think about this with your open cows. How much is it going to cost you if a technology or if tells you that your cow is in heat and they're not? So they're not in heat, you breed them anyway. You're out the cost of your time, the cost of the semen, and potentially the cost of not looking at her again for 28 to 48 days to go back and make sure that she doesn't need to be rebred. Same thing with a false negative. You're not pregnant. You miss out on a cow that's actually in estrus. So something that we're going to think about, we're going to do this pretty quickly, is how many events we can find. So we have 100 estrus events, 80 are identified by the technology, and 20 are missed by the technology. So we've got 80% that's actually identified. Is that a good enough for you? Do you want a little bit higher? And then we're going to think about how many alerts coincide with an actual event. Not just how many events do we get or how many alerts do we get, but how many of them are true. So we have 100 estrus alerts, but only 80 alerts are for cows actually in estrus, and 20 are alerts for cows that aren't in estrus. So if we go through and breed all of these, we've bred 20 cows that we didn't need to breed that aren't going to get pregnant. So if we think about this with 300 cows, we're going to do some quick math. We have 100 that have an alert and 200 that don't have an alert. And we have 100 that are in estrus and 200 that aren't in estrus. So we have our true positive rate of 80 and our false negative rate of 20, which gives us a sensitivity of 80%. The next thing that we're going to look at is our specificity. We have 20 false positives and 180 true negatives. And the thing that we need to think about with disease detection or with estrus detection is that most of the time, especially for disease detection, we're thinking about a high true negative rate. Cows that shouldn't alert and don't alert because nothing is going on with them. So we want our specificity to be high. So 90% is good. The bad thing about specificity and sensitivity is they're always fighting each other. So if one goes up, the other one tends to go down. What we would like to see is a sensitivity and a specificity both in the upper 80s to upper 90s, ideally. which doesn't generally ever happen, but it's kind of what we're hoping for. So end of the day, we want both of those to be as high as possible. And the reason this matters is because it directly impacts your economic value. So as sensitivity and specificity go up, we see more money. And we see this because it increases our heat detection, it increases our disease detection, and it increases our animal efficiency. We're going to talk about some case studies now in the last little bit of this. For robotic investment, we have a couple different situations that we can think about. We could think about a retrofit, and that's going to be the cost of the robot and facilities modification. If we think about a new construction, it's the cost of the robot, the cost of the facilities, and the cost of everything that goes into the facilities. And like I said before, there's no one size fits all. So the numbers that we have in literature, the numbers that we have from industry are kind of generalities. So instead of telling you what to spend exactly on a robot, I'm going to give you some ideas of situations where investing in a robot makes a little bit more sense. Some things that we need to think about are labor savings, increased milk production, age of facilities is really important, comparative cost, and quality of life. And like we talked about before, quality of life is that really crazy unknown one. Your quality of life economic value may be zero. Your quality of life economic value may be $50,000 to $100,000. It just kind of depends on you and what situation you're in and how much a robot is going to relieve that labor burden for you or give you peace of mind. If we think about the break-even cost, it needs to be greater than the robot cost plus the additional costs. And these are some kind of keys to think about because like I said, there's no real good number for how much you should spend on a robot. But if your increased labor cost, if your labor cost is very high, so as your labor cost goes up, your break-even cost goes up because you're going to see labor savings with a robot. So if you're spending a lot on workers, you can spend a little bit more on a robot. If you have an increased cost of the parlor that you're going to buy, so if you're going to get a parlor with all the bells and whistles, or it's going to take you a lot to upgrade your parlor to where you want to be, you can spend a lot more on a robot. Same thing with useful life. When this came out, it was in 2002. Robots were still fairly new to the scene. So we had useful lives of 7 up to 20 years. So for most of our robots now, we're probably talking about a 15 to 20 year useful life that's advertised by the company. But the longer it's going to last, the more you can spend on it. So we've got a Tennessee example, and we're going to assume that we need 2 robots for this farm. We have an assumed cost of $415,000 for the infrastructure and the units. And we have a break-even cost based on our below assumptions of $605,000. This is adapted from some of those economics from this paper in 2002. So we're milking 120 cows, and we're not going to change that after the investment. We were milking 2 times a day, and we're moving up to 3.2 milkings a day. Because of that increase in milkings, we're getting an increase in production, which means our break-even cost is going to go up. We can spend up to $605,000 on a robot and still break even in this scenario. I was spending $40,000 a year on milking labor before my robot. After my robot, I'm only spending $20,000 a year. My parlor was 15 years old, so it was definitely near the end of its useful life because the investment life of that parlor was only 10 years. I'm going to invest in a new robotic system with a 7-year useful life. So if you just moved into a shiny new parlor, investing in a robot is going to be a difficult sell for you because you just spent a lot of money on that parlor and it hasn't really paid you back for being on your property yet. If you have an older parlor, older facilities, investing in a robot is going to make a whole lot more sense for you financially because that facility has outlived its useful life. You're probably still using it. I'm not saying it's not usable, but from an economic standpoint, you can go ahead and invest in something else more confidently than someone who just built a new parlor. Now we're going to go to a different Tennessee example. So our cost hasn't changed. It's still $415,000, but our break-even cost is now $400,000. So it's less than the cost to go into that robot. And that's because we're milking 3 times a day. We're only going to go up to 3.2. So that 2-pound jump in production is not going to be enough to offset the cost of the parlor. My labor still decreases. That's fine. But I just put in a new parlor 2 years ago, and I've still got 10 years left on that parlor, or I've still got 8 years left on that parlor because it was a 10-year investment life. as opposed to a new robotic system that's only going to give me 7 years. Remember, this was back in 2002, so our useful life was lower for robots back then. So in this scenario, I can only spend $400,000 on a robot and all the infrastructure and the units to make it worthwhile on my farm. So this would not be a good investment for me. Some things to consider with robots: the facility is going to impact production and health. Putting in a robot is not magically going to increase your production. It's not magically going to improve your health. If you've got feet and leg problems before the robot and you don't redo the facilities, you're probably going to have feet and leg problems after the robot. If you have a high somatic cell count before the robot, if you have high environmental mastitis before the robot, you're probably also going to have those same problems after the robot, because those somatic cell count problems and those mastitis problems start in the environment. They don't start in the parlor. So you're just still going to be chasing those same problems that you had before. Another thing to think about is your starting level of milk production and your starting level of milkings. If you're already milking 3 times a day, you're going to have to make that robotic cell make more sense to you as far as a labor savings perspective and probably a quality of life and peace of mind perspective, because you're not going to see that dramatic increase in production or in visits that you would see if you were just a 2x herd. We think about heat detection, and we're going to go through these pretty quickly. We've got improved detection or maintained detection. If it does just as good a job as you do, but you're not having to be out there watching for heats all the time, if you're not having to put on patches, if you're not having to use tail paint, if you're not having to use all of that stuff or use timed artificial insemination, it's probably going to be a good investment. And again, there's a lot of different systems. You have neck or ear-based behavior monitoring, we have physiological monitoring, we have leg-based behavior monitoring. And with heat detection, we want it to be something that's easily incorporated into the herd. We normally have a device, a reader, and a base station. And these have been out there for quite some time. I think the first pedometer that was used for heat detection was in the 50s. It was not commercially available, but we've been working on this problem for quite some time. Same thing with this. We want a net present value greater than 0. And some of the things we think about are the cost of days open. How much is it costing me every single day to keep that open animal on my farm? We've got some pre-investment costs to consider, and this was a model done in 2016. That would be the bull, the technician, detection aids, or even timed artificial insemination. Now, Carmela also did a study looking at heat detection with a system versus timed artificial insemination. And she found that if you used a heat detection system, so some kind of wearable technology, and the one she tested was the AFI system, it worked just as well as using timed artificial insemination. So if they're both used well, they have similar results. So that's kind of a standard null across the board. But what she found from her model were general guidelines of what we saw before. If the tag cost increases, this is going to be true whether we're talking about heat detection, disease detection, or lameness detection with a wearable technology. If that tag cost goes up, the net present value goes down, so it gets closer to 0 or it goes negative, and the payback period goes up. It takes longer to pay off that investment. If you're using timed artificial insemination, your net present value goes down and your payback period goes up. And that's simply because what you're already doing is just as effective as what you would be doing with a wearable technology of some kind. So it's going to take longer to pay back that investment. If your installation cost goes up, just like if your tag cost goes up, your net present value goes down and your payback period goes up. The big one, though, is if you increase the technology estrus detection rate, so it becomes as good as what you're doing or better, the net present value goes up, it becomes a better investment, and the payback period goes down. If we look at a Tennessee example, we're going to assume a cost of around $25,000 or $24,500 for installation and tags, so all the hardware that you're going to need. And under this assumption, we got a net present value of $95,500 or $152 per cow per year. And the system paid for itself in 3/4 of a year. And that's because our heat detection rate went from just visual detection of 35% up to an 80% heat detection rate. Our rolling herd average didn't change. Our labor per year did go up, and our investment life was 5 years. But that increase in heat detection rate actually improved a lot of things on our farm. It's going to improve production because you're getting everybody cycled back faster. It's going to decrease some of those diseases. But mostly it's going to reduce that cost of days open and put a lot of money back in your pocket. as opposed to somebody who, again, the assumed cost is exactly the same, $24,500, but this time our net present value is negative $38,000 a year, or negative $61 per cow per year. And the payback period is longer than the life of technology, longer than 5 years. So still the same number of cows, but in this example, we have a heat detection rate of 80%, whether that's through our patches, whether that's through timed artificial insemination. We've got a heat detection rate of 80%. So we're not gaining anything with that technology, but our labor is going to go up every single year. So under those circumstances, it doesn't make sense to invest in a tag, which is why the first thing you need to do before you ever get to this point is look and see where the needs are on your farm. Cautions with heat detection, with estrus detection, with health detection as well, any kind of wearable really, they've got to be managed daily, and they have got to be attached correctly. If a net collar isn't on tight enough or is on too tight, that accelerometer will not work, and you'll get faulty data. If a leg tag is attached too loosely, it'll slip down and get caught underneath the dew claws. If it's on too tight, it'll start cutting off circulation. We need to think about sensitivity and specificity. We want to make sure they're in those high 80s to mid 90s when we invest in a technology, or else we're going to pay to put semen in cows that don't need it, or we're going to miss cows that do need it. And we've got to be willing to use that technology. If we're not willing to use it, it just sits on the desk as kind of a really expensive paperweight. And another big thing to think about is starting heat detection rate. If you're already in the ballpark of what that technology can do for you, I'm not saying don't invest in it, but I'm saying invest with caution. And we're going to pop through these pretty quickly. We are going to talk a little bit about inline monitoring because that's what Bethany's going to talk to us about here in a minute. And this is her system, SomaDetect, and it's an inline somatic cell counter. There are some other ones on the market that we'll talk about later. But basically what that's doing is it's looking at changes through near infrared to detect maybe fat and protein or somatic cell count, or maybe even things like progesterone or estrogen. Another one that's available as a robot add-on would be the D-Laval Herd Navigator, and it does some pretty cool things: progesterone, LDH for mastitis, and BHBA for ketosis. But the thing that we need to think about with an alert is, how effective is it going to be? And we talked about this earlier with how farmers use those alerts. We can see that 37% of them weren't looked at all across all of my farms, but that was very dependent on farmer. So some farmers hardly ever looked at the alerts or decided that they didn't really have to take an action based on them, where some farmers were pretty much an even split across all of them. So some they didn't look at, quite a few they checked the cow, some they didn't really think had a true action to take, and some of them were doubted, but they were pretty even across the board. So when you invest in a technology, do some background checking, see what it's going to do for you, what need it's going to answer. Because if it doesn't answer a need that you have, it's going to be a lot of unused technology data. Some of the reasons that we get these differences, particularly for behavior, is that there's a lot of noise from day to day with behavior data. And with that noise from day to day, we don't always have a true event happening with it. So some of them are going to be true. We've got metritis at the start of the lactation. Sometimes there's a hoof trim, and that's going to change it. Anytime the vet comes out, that's going to change it, because we're looking at an individual animal and deviations from her normal baseline. With disease detection, there really aren't many systems marketed only for disease. It's generally an additional benefit from an existing system. So you're going to get benefits not just from disease detection, but from estrus detection rate, improved milk production, and the retention payoff, or keeping those early lactation culls in the herd longer. So with this Tennessee example, we've got a tag that also does health detection, that same overall cost because it's an add-on, but now our net present value is $131,000 per year, or $208 per cow per year, and a payback period of about half of a year. So we've increased our heat detection rate from that 35% up. We've increased our rolling herd average because we've reduced our disease incidence, and we've reduced our early lactation culls. We reduced our culling rate by 25%, and our labor still went up. But with all of these things working together from that one technology, we were able to improve what we had per cow per year. And again, that's still going to depend on what's happening on your farm. If we don't see that estrus detection rate change, and we don't see that culling rate change, we only change one thing, like we marginally increase milk production, it isn't necessarily going to pay for itself. So it's less negative than it was if we were just looking at heat detection rate on its own, but it's still a negative value and it takes longer than 5 years to pay it off. Something that I thought was really cool from some of the modeling work that I did in my PhD was if we assumed that production increased marginally, like a pound in the bulk tank a day, so not a huge amount, estrus detection rate increased some. So from the average of all of the herds that we had in PC DART records from the last 10 years, and it increased to what the average would be for technology. And then if retention payoff also improved, our net present value was greater than 0 in 99% out of our 10,000 iterations. So we tested this a lot, and 99% of the time, it was a good decision with a $233 average payback per cow per year and a payback period of less than a year if all of those things were changing together. So as a reminder, not many systems detect individual changes. It's an uncertain direction after the alert because what do we do after we say something may be wrong? We've got to manage it daily. We've got to attach it correctly. And again, we've got to be willing to use that technology. There's a couple out there that people invest in fairly frequently. And again, it's that quality of life value that we have a really hard time putting an economic value on. So we don't really know the economic value of a feed pusher. And we definitely don't know the economic value of a cow brush, but I know we like seeing them out there. So that was a lot of stuff to throw at you. So some main take-home considerations. From the technology side, when you purchase that technology, it has got to fill an on-farm need. It has to have a practical outcome, and it has to enhance or replace your labor or your observation. And it absolutely has to have a good service team. From the farmer side, you have got to be willing to use that technology. Having the technology in and of itself is not going to enhance your operation. You have got to be willing to use the technology. And you've got to be a good manager. You've got to be able to take that data from your cows and from that system and put them both together. You've got to be able to incorporate that technology into the farm and into your daily management practices. And you have to have a good service team because like everything else, it can and will go wrong. So having someone in your corner when that happens is really important. So remember, with the technology, you're going to go from something like this, paper and pad, to something like this, animal information, group numbers, lactation days, and then some kind of eating information. Are there any questions before I head it over to Bethany? I know that was a lot. All right, I'm not hearing anything. Bethany, would you like to introduce yourself again and talk a little bit about SomaDetect and what y'all do?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to share my screen with everyone. Okay. Do we see that?
I can.
Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so my name is Bethany. I am CEO of a company called SomaDetect, and we're a precision dairy company developing an inline system for farms. And so we fit into a lot of what Liz has just spoken about. I'm pretty excited to share this with you today. So our system, it's an inline system, fits into existing dairy equipment. We essentially plug into the milk hose and provide all kinds of measurements in pretty rapidly without using any milk or without using any chemicals or consumables to do so. We are able to, with one system, provide a lot of different information, things like milk component data, reproduction information, as well as detection of two diseases, mastitis and ketosis. And we do this because it's a little incredible. So we're an AI company, but not AI in terms of artificial insemination, but AI in terms of artificial intelligence. And so we have a sensor that is capturing images of light going through milk. And then we use all kinds of deep learning algorithms to output different data and display that back to farmers on site. So It's a pretty exciting thing, brand new thing. At the moment, we are really focused on pregnancy determinations as well as somatic cell counts, and then collecting data for a whole bunch of other things to be able to, with one sensor, deliver more and more value over time. So, and the fun part of this, it's once you put the equipment in, that's it. It's not like we are changing this box every year or every few years. It's the sensor does its work, and then we build software algorithms to be able to detect more and more. At the moment, we're working with 6 farms in both Canada and the US, and collecting data from about 8,000 cows. And I'm just going to show you, these are a few photos of our sensors. This is actually in the basement parlor of Cornell University. And so you can see each of our sensors, it's one per milking stall, which is what allows us to have individual cow data. So we, you know, pregnancy, you don't care if it's not about a group of cows being pregnant. It really comes down to which cows are pregnant. This is another basement parlor here, a more traditional parlor. And then this is our first rotary installation as well that we're really excited about. How good is it? So a lot of what Liz spoke about had to do with accuracy, sensitivity, specificity. How do we use this data? And I won't dive too much into the math today, but I'll just give some examples. So we determined pregnancy across 2 farms. We're always trying to build a model that works really well, not just on one farm, but of course is able to move to different areas. And so we looked at 17 days of data on what I'm calling farm number 1, and then 5 days of data on farm number 2. We found essentially 11 errors in the open open across all 17 days, 0 for pregnancy, and then on the second farm, 0 errors in the open class and 0 errors in the pregnant class. How is this possible? It's really unusual. I mean, you know, Liz said this, it's really hard to have high sensitivity, high specificity both. And, but the way we do this is actually that our models, one of the things we found incredibly powerful is that we look at data not just on a given day, but over time. So it's not about which cow is pregnant on a single day, but if we stack up, you know, 10 days or 5 days of data, can we get a pretty strong signal? And that's what we've been finding. So these are actually cows that were inseminated for this. It results 18 to 25 days following breeding and 10 days prior to the typical vet confirmation. And this is an example of seeing the signal for pregnancy increase and actually give us a really strong indication that we're looking at successfully inseminated or pregnant cows. It works fairly well in reverse as well. So these, both these cows were identified as pregnant at the first preg check. They had a second preg check scheduled at around the 60-day mark. And but they had lost, it was early embryonic loss, and found that the signal essentially decreased over time. And so we were able to say, no, these cows are open, and later had that rechecked and verified. We do the same thing with somatic cell counts. So we are looking at data from every cow at every milking and finding that you know, it's this data over time that truly gives us the most value. So this is a really simple calculation we've done. So it's about 28 milking events from about 400 cows. And essentially we just split it up where we looked at those that most frequently, out of 28, how many of them had very frequently SCC above 200,000, and then how many of them didn't. So you know, every cow had one higher SCC indication at least once, but only a few of them had them on a regular basis. And this is just some of the raw data that we look at. So you can see the top line is, we've just picked out a 5-day period here. So top line shows cows that are consistently healthy. The second line, we see cows where they have one event. The yellow line, or the yellow tick mark, is an indicator when it's between 2 and 400,000. And then the upper, the red, is above 400,000 SCC. And we see that, so in the second line, cows are, you know, something is happening. They have one change one of the milking days, but then goes right back down. So no action needed. The third line shows what we're seeing is indication of subclinical, and then in some cases transitioning to clinical mastitis. So these are ones where we say to farmers, you know, please take a look at this. Please, you know, track these cows. And the last line, these are chronically high SEC cows. And so whether you want them in your herd is completely up to you, but we find it helpful to at least so that farmers know which ones are the highest SECs and consistently high SEC cows in the herd. It's all delivered. We at the moment have our own software system. So exactly as Liz said, we've tried these three panels here give indications of basically checklists. So cows on the most left, they've been identified as pregnant before, but are starting to have repeated open indications. So we're saying you might want to just do a double check on those cows. Between the first and second pregnancy check, we have another list where we are identifying cows that have likely lost an early embryo. And then the last list that we give here is actually cows that have been confirmed pregnant. They're higher in terms of days carrying calf, but have started to have much more consistent open predictions. So it might be later stage fetal loss that we want to take a look at. SCC, we do it similar ways. We look at number of indications of high SCC in the past sort of 5 milkings, as well as the percent change. And so that's our technology. We found that looking at this data over time gives farmers much more actionable information that they can actually do something with without having to have a technology. We're not 100% accurate, right? So it doesn't need to be 100% accurate because we are able to look at that data over time. I'm going to skip this one. This is kind of our installation procedure and what we're up to today. So we have, as I said, algorithms for pregnant. So more than 250 sensors installed across multiple farms. Algorithm development focused on pregnancy and SCC. We do have research initiatives both with Cornell University and the University of Guelph, and an API from DairyComp. So there's no need to double input data into our system and DairyComp. We pull cow records from there, which has been enormously helpful. In the next 12 months, we're looking to add another 20,000 cows to our platform and to measure out and communicate this return on investment, as we've spoken about. It's so critical. And so part of what we're looking for is any farmers interested in taking part in an early adopter program, or who are interested in learning more or providing input to what we're building. So here it is. If you're interested, please feel free to get in touch. My email, as well as Ryan Cobb, he's a member of my team. Both of our emails are there. You can also check out our website at somatic.com, and there is a form there. If you want to fill that out, we'll get in contact with you directly. That's it. That was incredibly quick. If anyone has any questions, I would welcome them now. Otherwise, I do want to say as well a huge thanks to Liz for having me here today to present some of what we're building.
Thank you, Bethany. That was great. I really like the fact that y'all aren't just doing kind of one stagnant algorithm, but y'all are developing it over time. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's such an incredible thing that we can do today with technology that I think even 10 years ago we weren't capable of. But it means that you can build something on a farm and kind of get to a place where it's delivering some value, probably not the most value, but some value, and then build it from there, get more accurate, and ultimately tune things so that they actually meet because as you said, every farm is different. Every farmer is concerned with different things, and their herd is a little bit different. And so that's one of the ways we basically tune algorithms to a specific farm, but are also eager to work with our farmers to build something that they actually use and that truly meets the needs of their individual dairy, because it's not one size fits all.
So do we have something in the chat? So we have a question that says, what's the next step beyond progesterone and somatic cell counts, say in 10 years?
Oh, well, within 10, so I'll go back to the slide I had before. Our next things that we want to build. So a lot of this comes down to what data we can get and how quickly we can get the data, and how robust the data is. So for example, with pregnancy is a great one. We get information every day on whether a cow is pregnant or not. And that data, after a certain point, is never wrong. Like there's a point at which we can look at a cow and know that they're pregnant. And so we can trust that data. Most farms keep really great, really clean records on reproduction. So we can use that to build algorithms really nicely. Next, that's where some of the diseases, so ketosis, for example, we sometimes have really good records. We don't necessarily get that on every farm, and it's not an issue on every farm. Fat and protein would be other priorities as well, because those are records we can get through DHI, but it does require sampling a lot of data, essentially. The sort of bees, we kind of consider the bee's knees being heat detection. And so that's something we're excited about, we're collecting data on. The challenge is, contrary, so cows are pregnant every day, they're in heat, a couple times a year, once a month kind of thing. And so we get that data much slower. So 10 years out, I would anticipate we can do nearly all of the things, certainly in this middle list of, ketosis, fat, protein, antibiotic residuals, heat detection. We've tested all of those in a lab and know that we're able to get really strong signals. It's just a matter of getting the number of cows on the platform and the data that we need to build that. And then from there, we'll see what else we can do. We'll play around with other technologies. But that's actually, that's one of the things we're particularly excited about, is that we can deliver value today with pregnancy and SCC. It's quite a strong value proposition, but we know that it will only continue to grow as the sensor gets on more and more farms.
Are there any more questions for Bethany or for me about anything we talked about today? Obviously, if it's anything we talked about today, probably direct those to me and not Bethany. Y'all are a quiet bunch today. All right, everybody. I know I've kept you longer than the 1 o'clock cutoff. As a reminder, if you want Master Dairy credit for this meeting, please go to that link at https://tiny.utk.edu/tmdp_form and go through and fill that out. I was told that it was not updated, which was my bad, but this presentation is on there for y'all to select as an option. If you went through it beforehand and did it, just let me know and I'll get y'all recorded. But thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you next month.